Welcome grade 9s. Today we're going to talk about our third lesson in probability and statistics, and this is the difference between samples and populations and when to do a census and when to do a sample. So let's get started. To estimate the number of fish in a river, conservationists use a strategy called mark and recapture. At one place in the river, they capture some fish by using nets. The fish are then marked with a tag and released, and downriver they repeat the operation and track the number of tagged and non-tagged fish. They can then estimate the salmon population from this. So the first question is, who would be interested in knowing the number of salmon in a river? Well, I think it's pretty obvious it's going to be the conservationists, the fishermen, the government who is monitoring the environment. Sometimes they shut down rivers to make sure the fish population can rebuild itself. Now, why can't the biologist catch all the fish? The reason is it's not physically possible unless you're going to block the river totally with a net, and you'd end up killing a lot of fish in the process. Now, why did they tag the fish? They want to make sure that they don't count the fish twice. When they're marked, you can count them once and then release them again. So what assumptions do the biologists make about the second sample of fish? They're assuming that the proportion of marked and unmarked salmon is evenly distributed throughout the whole length of the river, and that one place in the river doesn't have more and another one doesn't have less. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do an exercise on finding the percentage of male and female fish in a river. We're going to be doing this by using 50 small pieces of paper, and I want you to cut them all out, and on some of them I want you to mark M for male and F for female. It doesn't matter what you mark on the paper as long as all 50 are marked with either a male or a female. You can do either way you wish. Now, I want you to fold the paper over twice to cover the M or the F on the paper. And I want you to record the actual number of males and females in your collection and write it on a piece of paper and place it in your notes. Do not tell anyone the percentages. Now, if you're at home, you could probably get somebody else to do this for you, but you'll still be able to do it even if you do know the percentages. If you're at school, you could exchange the bag of paper with another person and you both do this exercise, and then only you would know the actual number of the 50 fish in your bag and the other person would know the number in their bag. So with the bag from another student, or if you only have your own with yours, I want you to remove 10 pieces of paper and record the results in the table on the next page. Then I want you to refold the paper, put it back in the bag, shake it up, and now I want you to remove 20 and record how many females and males you have. Then fold them all back, put them in the bag. Then I would like you to remove 40 pieces of paper from the bag and record the results in the table on the next page. Okay, once that's all done, you can just set them aside. Here. So when I did it for the 10, this is what I received. When I drew 10, 4 of them were male and 6 were female. So there was my first sample, 4 male, 6 female. When I went to the second sample, the 20s, I ended up getting 6 male and 14 female. Now the 40 fish one, the largest one, I ended up getting 21 male and 19 female. So could you guess the population estimate accurately from the 10 fish here? Could you guess accurately from 4 and 6? Probably not, right? The 20 to 14 on mine is a little bit misleading because due to the fact that this is random, I would have assumed that this would go closer to a 50-50, right? Because this is what my estimate was. I figured out they were roughly 50-50. Now, it just so happens when I did this, I didn't know it, but I ended up doing exactly 25 males and 25 females. I didn't even know it. So either way, when I counted it all up, I was going like, well, this looks good because 40 is 60, 52 to 47, that means you're getting closer to 50 to 50. But this 20 fish one, that causes me an issue because it actually went away from the 50 to 50. So can you guess it from the 10 fish sample? Not accurately. Now what happened as your sample size, now your sample is how many you chose out of the bag. This was a sample of 10, this is a sample of 20, this is a sample of 40. As we increased the sample, the number of males and females approached the actual numbers that were there in reality. So which sample was most reliable? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the largest sample is most reliable, and the reason for that is it's actually closest to the actual population of the fish. I took 40 out of the 50 as my sample. Right? The only thing better than that would be doing 50 out of 50, and that would give me the exact number. So now, if you did this with somebody else, they could give you the numbers they had in their bag. If you did it yourself, just you can get this all out and figure out how close your estimate was to the real population. So how close your estimate was to the real population depends on two things. One is the sample size. Okay. Now, even the sample sizes can be misleading, so that's random. So that's the second thing which is going to come into play here. The fact that you're drawing these from a bag is a random. And if you know anything about random results, they can be anything. So going on, how could you check the sample results you got were actually close to the true population? Well, this is where what happened to me back here can be fixed. You see how this one was way off? If I did this thing like 5 times, I would get much closer here to the 50-50. Probably not as close as this one, but it would be farthest away, closer and closest. And it would close in on the 50-50. That's why we do it many times. You don't just do it once. Let's take a look at sample, census, and population. Now, when you collect data from the population is the group you're getting stuff from. So if you're talking about the number of gophers in a field, the population is all the gophers. If you're talking about the number of chocolate bars produced in a factory, it is all the chocolate bars. If you're talking about the people who are going to vote in your country, that is the total population of the country. Right? That is the large group that you're getting information about. The census is conducted when the data are collected from every member of the population. That's a census, all right? It's not a sampling, it's a census because every single member is actually measured. Now, you take a sample when it's not possible to take a census. For example, if you were in Canada and you wanted to do a census on who's going to vote for which election, and your population was 36 million Canadians, it's not possible for you to contact every person in Canada. So in that situation, you would take a sample. So a sample is when you collect the information from part of your population. The larger your sample, the more it's going to represent your population. And once you have your sample, you can make what are called inferences. Now, an inference is when you take and you relate the sample to the population and you make your prediction. When your sample represents your population, you can make what's called a valid conclusion. And this is when you say that your sample is proportional to your population. So that your sample represents your population, and you can use your sample to make a conclusion. What things do you have to consider when selecting if you collect information from a sample or conduct a census? Well, the first things that always come up when you're talking about samples versus census is cost and time. These are the two major considerations you must consider. Sometimes the size of the population is an issue. It would take too long to do the census to contact everybody, or too long to measure every thing that was produced. If you're in a ball bearing factory and producing millions of ball bearings, you don't have time to measure every single one of those ball bearings. So that is when you do a sample. However, if you are only in a classroom of 50 people or 20 people, you could do a census because then time and cost are very, very low. So now we're going to work on explaining why data are collected from populations. In each case below, I want you to explain why a census was performed rather than collecting data from a sample. So we're going to get you to tell me why a census and not a sample. So Bob is going on a vacation with his family. To determine the destination to go to, Bob asks all his family members where they would like to go. So why did Bob use a census here and not a sample? So pause the recording and put your answer down. Okay, well, the most obvious one here is that it's only a family. Because the population of a family is like 5, 6, 7, whatever, even if it's only 10 people, or you have a very large family, doing the census is very quick, Very easy and very cheap. Now, if the sample was collected, the sample would be too small to represent the population. So, for example, if you ask Bob's sister, her destination may not represent the total family. To determine the average age of students in a small town school, Bob asks the grade 9 students in his class their age. Why did Bob do a census here and not a sample? Pause the recording and write your answer down. So the collection of the ages in his classmates, is easy, it's quick. You can do it in the classroom in the morning by just a show of hands or just by having them just answer a quick question. The reason he did the census was because the number of grade 9 students in the class, or in that school even if there's multiple grade 9 classes, is really small, and it's very easy to do the census. Every 5 years, Statistics Canada conducts a census of all Canadians. One question in the survey is used to determine the age of each person in the household. So why does the Government of Canada do a census every 5 years and not a sampling? Okay, so pause the recording and write down why the government did a census. Now the census is very expensive, but it's very, very important. The importance of collecting data from all Canadians is used for future planning in municipalities, taxes, education, and other types of services. It tells whether towns are growing or growing smaller. It talks about the cities, their planning, whether they need new housing. All of this information is gathered. And if you do it once every 5 years, you get an accurate amount of information because you're doing everybody, in this case, the census. If you did a sample, you would have problems because one part of Canada is not the same as another because we're so diverse. So rather than doing a sample here, we do a census. Reasoning why and when a sample should be used now. So determine whether students want to go to ranch camp again next year. The grade 9 set up a desk and surveyed students as they passed by in the hall at lunch. They kept a record and were managed to survey 75% of the students in the junior high. So in this situation, why do you think the sample is used and not a census? So pause the recording and write down your answer. Due to absences and the issues of getting to all students, this method was chosen. All right, they didn't want to track down the people who weren't in the classes. Now in grade 9, people go to all different classes. Maybe they've got structured classes where you have different levels of learning, in which case getting to all of them may have been difficult. But in this situation, they chose to do it this way. Do you think that the sample would represent the population? Now, they have 3/4 of the kids, 75%. So if they've got 75%, do you think that that sample would be enough to represent the population? So pause the recording and write down your answer and why. Okay? 75% of the population was surveyed. That's a very large sample, and it is representative of the population. Okay, some other examples. To determine the health of beluga whales in the Arctic, scientists capture and examine whales, and then they release them. So why do you think a sample is used in this data collection system? So pause the recording and write down your answer. The beluga whales in the Arctic are all over the place. You cannot locate them all. You can't catch and release all the beluga whales. It's just not possible. So to do that, you have to have a sample. Now, what factors do you feel the scientists should consider when they select their sample? So pause the recording and tell me, what should the scientists consider when they choose their sample? They have to consider the impact on the health of the whales that they capture. Capturing a whale is very traumatic for them. Second thing is whales travel in pods. So the effect of the capture that would have on the pod when one of their members is taken. The cost of living in the Arctic for the time needed to sample, right? When you're going to go around doing this, it's very, very pricey. Okay, let's look at identifying and critiquing the use of samples. A province considers banning cell phones in all its schools. To determine how students feel about this issue, you, as an individual, sampled your school. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to tell me what is the population for this this situation here. So pause the recording and tell me what's the population. Well, here we go. Since it's a decision by the province for all the schools in the province, the population is going to be all students in the province. Now, what is a sample? Pause the recording and tell me what you think the sample is in this situation. Okay. Well, since you're doing the sampling in your school, that means that the sample is everybody you ask in that school. Okay, so why was a sample collected and a census not done? Okay, so pause the recording and tell me why. Okay, well, this particular question, I've included it because there's some issues with it. First off, number one, you can't ask every student in the province. It's too expensive. You're talking about every school, every student, every classroom. That's not going to work. That's why you would have to use a sample. Now, the problem with the sampling method is in this situation. You can't do a sample for the province from one school. There are too many different diverse cultures and too many diverse places up north, down south, in the inner city, rural. The actual sample is too localized and too small. Do you think the sample will be a valid representation? Of course, I've already answered this. The answer to that is no, definitely not. The whole province is the population, and your small school cannot represent every student across the province. Your sample is just way too small. Okay, let's go on to our next example. In the local town election for the mayor, all adults 18 years and older are asked who they are going to vote for on election day. So the first thing I want you to do is pause the recording and tell me what is the population for this example. Okay, so because it's a town election and all adults 18 years and older are asked, that would mean that everybody in the town who's 18 years old and older will be your population. Okay, so pause and tell me why a sample or a census should be conducted. What do you think should be done here? Okay, well, if you look up here, it says all adults 18 years and older were asked. So that would mean that you didn't do a sampling. You asked everybody. So that makes it a census. Now, some members of the town are concerned about the cost of conducting a census. What argument would you use to defend the conducting of a census? So you want to do the census, and you're making the argument for the census. So pause the recording and write down your argument. Okay, the biggest advantage of a census is always accuracy. If you ask everybody, then you get 100% accuracy. There's no worries about your sample representing your population. Now, I want you to do the reverse. What argument would you use against using the census? So pause the recording and tell me that. Okay, now whenever you're talking about a sampling, the reason you do sampling is because of cost and time. Right? A proper sample of the residents of the town would have been all that's required. If you asked everybody, then you actually have the votes for your mayor. So what you'd be doing is you'd be doing the voting process for electing your mayor to determine who was going to vote which way to elect your mayor, which makes it absolutely redundant. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Tough Stuff Incorporated is marketing ladders to the construction companies of Alberta. They want to ensure that the ladders they are manufacturing are strong enough for use on the construction sites. So, to find out if a ladder meets the safety requirements, they load the ladders with weight until they fail and they break. So here's the first question. Should the manufacturers in Tough Stuff Incorporated, should they do a census or should they do a sample, and then tell me why? So pause the recording and do that. All right. Well, here's the thing. This should be a sample, all right? Because if you break every ladder that they produce, what are they going to sell? It's not possible to do that. You'd put yourself out of business very quickly if you produced all those ladders and then turned around and busted them. Okay, so that wraps up this one. I want you to do your assignment. So if you have any questions, rewatch the video or come and see me.